I didn't believe in ghosts until I met her. David had always been a skeptic. Life had thrown him enough curveballs, but ghosts, that was a joke in his eyes. He'd just moved into a small, aging cottage on the outskirts of town, a place so cheap it felt like a steal. The realtor's warning about the house's history seemed like nothing more than a sales gimmick to him. A haunted house, please. The first few nights were uneventful, but then strange things started happening. Lights flickered, footsteps echoed in the hall when no one was there, and sometimes, in the dead of night, David swore he could hear a soft whisper calling his name. But what sent chills down his spine wasn't just the unexplained events, it was her. It was one of those nights where sleep wouldn't come. David found himself wide awake, lying in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. He rolled over to grab his phone, but when he glanced up, his breath caught in his throat. At the foot of his bed stood a woman. She was pale, ethereal, her long dark hair framing a face so delicate, it almost looked like porcelain. Her eyes, hollow yet deep, seemed to stare right through him, but there was no malice. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching him. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice that sounded like the rustle of wind through dry leaves, she replied,
"I'm the one who's been waiting."
In the days that followed, David tried to convince himself that the encounter was just a dream. But every night, she returned. The initial fear he felt began to fade, replaced by something he couldn't quite explain. Fascination, curiosity, maybe both. Her name, as she eventually revealed, was Evelyn. She had once lived in the very house David now called home, many years ago, back when the town was smaller and secrets were easier to bury. She never told him how she died, and for some reason, David never asked. It didn't seem to matter. The more they talked, the more David found himself drawn to her. Her voice, though soft and distant, was calming. She spoke of things long forgotten, a time when the town bustled with life, the laughter that once filled the house, and the love she had once known. David didn't care that she was a ghost. In her presence, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: connection. It was absurd, but the more time he spent with her, the more he found himself falling for her. One evening, as the wind howled outside, David was sitting by the fireplace, waiting for Evelyn's nightly appearance. But instead, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Hargrove, his elderly neighbor, and the town's unofficial historian. She seemed anxious, clutching a worn leather book in her hands.
"You need to leave that house, David. I've lived here long enough to know its history. That woman, Evelyn, she's not what you think."
David felt a chill creep up his spine. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hargrove flipped open the book, revealing an old photograph of the house, with a familiar face staring back at him. "Evelyn. She died over a century ago, murdered by her lover. He betrayed her, and in her anger, she cursed this place." David's heart raced. That can't be true. She's not dangerous.
She wasn't, not until someone falls in love with her again. That's when the curse comes alive. She's waiting for you to make the same mistake her lover did, to break her heart again.
David felt the world tilt. Was it true? Could Evelyn be hiding something darker? That night, when Evelyn appeared, David's mind was spinning. He couldn't look at her the same way. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. "Why didn't you tell me?" David asked, his voice shaky. Evelyn tilted her head, her hollow eyes locking onto his.
"Tell you what?"
"That you're cursed," he whispered. "That you were murdered." Her expression didn't change, but the room seemed to grow darker.
Would it have mattered?
David's heart thudded painfully in his chest. "Did you? Were you waiting for me to fall in love with you?" For the first time, her ethereal form flickered. She stepped closer, her voice softer than ever.
"Does it matter?"
David swallowed hard. He knew Mrs. Hargrove's warning, but standing there, looking at Evelyn, he couldn't bring himself to believe she was dangerous. His heart screamed that it wasn't her fault, that she wasn't a monster, but the lingering doubt gnawed at him. Tell me the truth, he whispered. Are you waiting for me to betray you? Evelyn's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked more human than ghost.
I've waited for so long to be loved again, but I fear what comes after.
David's mind raced. Could he break the curse? Could he love her without doom hanging over them? Or was he already too deep, destined to repeat the tragedy? He took a deep breath, his mind made up. Then let me be the one who loves you. As the wind howled outside, David reached out to touch her, his hand passing through her ghostly form. Her eyes glistened with something that could have been sorrow or hope. But as dawn approached, Evelyn's figure began to fade, her form flickering like a dying flame.
I wish things were different.
And just like that, she was gone.